Tonight we begin with an ultimatum that Western intelligence officials had tracked, that diplomatic analysts had anticipated, and that Ukrainian leadership had prepared to answer with unwavering resolve. An ultimatum that unfolded not over months of quiet diplomatic maneuvering, but in a single dramatic 36-hour window. 36 hours that exposed the desperation at the heart of Russian strategy. 36 hours that tested the unity of the transatlantic alliance. 36 hours that culminated in a display of defiance that will echo through the history of this conflict. What Vladimir Putin did this week crossed a threshold that the international community had hoped would remain uncrossed. A direct, public demand to two of the world's most powerful democracies, delivered with threats that invoked the darkest possibilities of modern warfare. And when that ultimatum was issued, Volodymyr Zelensky did not hesitate. He responded with courage, with clarity, and with a defiance that reminded the world exactly why Ukraine continues to fight. This is the story of how a dictator tried to break an alliance with threats, and how a wartime president answered with actions that spoke louder than any ultimatum could. For several weeks now, there had been warnings, not official diplomatic communications, not formal intelligence assessments, just warnings, that Vladimir Putin was preparing something dramatic in his messaging to the West. Putin has been threatening, yes, but he has been theatrical in his threatening. His statements have followed a certain pattern, a predictability, almost a routine that Western capitals had learned to decode and, to some extent, dismiss. The nuclear rhetoric would spike before major diplomatic events. The warnings about Western weapons would intensify before new aid packages. The claims about escalation would crescendo before military reversals became public. It was, in many ways, background noise. But what set off alarm bells in Washington, London, and Kyiv this week was that the pattern suddenly shifted. Intelligence analysts who monitor Kremlin communications know the indicators. The unusual coordination between Putin's public schedule and military movements. The summoning of Russian ambassadors from key Western capitals for consultations. The activation of state media messaging, campaigns that precede major announcements. The sudden intensification of nuclear force exercises. All of that activity spiked simultaneously. And whenever the Kremlin coordinates across multiple channels with that level of intensity, it means something significant is about to happen. Putin was preparing not just another statement. He was preparing an ultimatum. And he wanted the world to watch. Early Tuesday morning, Russian state television began promoting what the Kremlin described as an address of historic importance, to be delivered by President Putin. The promotional language itself was unusual, invoking comparison to wartime addresses of the Soviet era, suggesting that what was coming would fundamentally alter the relationship between Russia and the West. When Putin finally appeared on screen, flanked by the symbols of Russian state power, he delivered what he called a final communication to Washington and London. The ultimatum contained 3 specific demands. First, that the United States and United Kingdom immediately cease all military aid to Ukraine, including weapons, intelligence, and training support. Second, that both nations publicly acknowledge that their support for Ukraine constitutes hostile action against the Russian Federation. Third, that Western capitals agree to a new security architecture that would effectively give Russia veto power over the defense decisions of its neighbors. These are the kinds of demands that a nuclear power only makes when they are signaling something very specific. A willingness to escalate, a test of adversary resolve, or a desperate attempt to change a trajectory that is moving against them. Western observers didn't know which category this fell into, or whether Putin intended all 3 at once. But what they did know was that Russia was fundamentally changing its diplomatic posture. And when a nuclear-armed adversary shifts from implicit pressure to explicit ultimatums, The entire security establishment of the Western world takes notice. The question facing President Biden, Prime Minister Starmer, and President Zelensky was stark. How do you respond to demands that are designed to humiliate, to coerce, and to fracture an alliance that has held together against extraordinary pressure? The answer came within hours. And it came with a force that even the Kremlin could not have anticipated. The assessment issued by the National Security Council tonight was not normal. It was not routine. It was not diplomatic. It was urgent. Official after official who attended emergency briefings described Putin's ultimatum as unprecedented in its public directness, reckless in its implications, and perhaps most importantly, revealing of a leader who has run out of conventional options to achieve his objectives. But ultimatums only work if the target hesitates. Zelensky did not. In fact, his response was among the most defiant and powerful we've seen from any leader in this entire conflict. Here's what we know. Within 4 hours of Putin's address, Zelensky convened an emergency session of Ukraine's National Security and Defense Council. Within 6 hours, he appeared on camera, not from a bunker, not from a secure location, but from the streets of Kyiv, to deliver his response. This wasn't the careful, diplomatic language we sometimes hear from wartime leaders trying to avoid provocation. This was a direct, unflinching rejection, delivered with the kind of moral clarity that Ukraine has displayed from the very first day of the invasion. And behind the words, Ukraine was already preparing actions. Within 12 hours of Zelensky's speech, Ukrainian forces launched a coordinated strike operation that demonstrated exactly what defiance looks like when it's backed by Western weapons and Ukrainian courage. Tonight, Ukrainian military sources confirmed that their armed forces launched precision strikes on 19 high-value Russian targets, including a major command center in the Belgorod region that had recently been designated as the coordination hub for Russian operations in northeastern Ukraine. Ukraine struck before Russia could reinforce its air defenses. They hit ammunition storage facilities containing shells and missiles intended for attacks on Ukrainian cities. They hit communications infrastructure that linked Russian frontline units to rear command. They hit logistics hubs that were stockpiling fuel for a planned winter offensive. They hit radar installations that were tracking Ukrainian air movements. They hit command bunkers where senior Russian officers were planning operations. In other words, Ukraine targeted the infrastructure of Russia's war machine. The nodes that coordinate, the depots that supply, the systems that command. This is what made Zelensky's defiance so significant. Putin's ultimatum wasn't just rhetoric, it was a calculated attempt to intimidate. It represented the kind of pressure that could fracture alliances if left unanswered. And Zelensky, understanding that fully, responded with overwhelming force. Not recklessly, not indiscriminately, but with strategic precision, designed to send a message that no one could misinterpret. They didn't target civilian areas. They didn't strike non-military infrastructure. They hit Russian military logistics. They hit Russian command and control. Every single target was selected to demonstrate that Ukraine will not be intimidated, will not be coerced, and will not surrender. And the early assessments suggest the operation was devastatingly effective. And here's where the story becomes even more illuminating. Western intelligence analysts now believe that Putin's ultimatum was designed to fracture Western unity at a moment of perceived political transition. Putin wanted to see whether the approaching changes in American political dynamics might create hesitation in Washington. Putin wanted to test whether the relatively new Labour government in Britain might prove more susceptible to pressure than its predecessor. Putin wanted to gauge whether public war weariness in Western democracies might finally translate into political pressure to reduce support for Ukraine. But instead, the opposite happened. Zelensky didn't wait for Washington and London to formulate their responses. He delivered his own answer, so swift, so powerful, so unequivocal, that he effectively set the tone for the entire Western response. You don't often see a wartime president of a country under invasion take the lead in responding to nuclear-armed threats. But that is exactly what Zelensky did. A senior NATO official speaking with our producers under condition of anonymity described Putin's ultimatum as strategic coercion, an attempt to create artificial pressure that would force concessions without Russia having to achieve them on the battlefield. But Zelensky proved today that Ukraine remains both militarily capable and politically defiant. His response was not only rhetorically powerful, it was backed by military action so coordinated that Russian air defenses were overwhelmed before they could respond effectively. That combination matters because it demonstrates that Zelensky is not just speaking for himself. He is speaking as the leader of a nation that has the capability and the will to back up its words with action. It shows that Ukraine is not simply waiting for Western decisions. They are shaping the response themselves. As reports continued coming in throughout the night, we learned more about the full scale of Ukraine's defiant response. Ukrainian missile forces carried out strikes on a major Russian airbase, reportedly destroying or damaging at least 10 aircraft before they could be scrambled. Ukrainian special operations units targeted a railway bridge that had been used to transport military equipment from Russia into occupied territory. Ukrainian naval drones operating in the Black Sea reportedly struck a Russian logistics vessel carrying ammunition to Crimea. Ukrainian cyber units, coordinating with kinetic operations, reportedly disrupted Russian military communications across 3 operational sectors. Ukrainian long-range drones struck fuel depots deep inside Russian territory, creating fires that burned for hours. This wasn't just a symbolic gesture. This wasn't just a rhetorical response. This was combined arms warfare executed with precision. This was defiance translated into military action. And strategic coherence is the one thing Russia has struggled to maintain since the early disastrous weeks of the invasion. For every demand Putin makes, Ukraine has demonstrated the capability to make him pay a price. For every threat Russia issues, Ukraine has shown that it cannot be intimidated into submission. Tonight's operations were the most dramatic example yet of that pattern. Remember, Putin thought Ukraine would collapse in 3 days. He thought Zelensky would flee Kyiv within hours of the invasion. He thought Ukrainian resistance would crumble once Russian tanks rolled across the border. He thought the West would offer token condemnation and then return to business as usual. He thought wrong. But tonight, we're watching the latest chapter in Putin's ongoing miscalculation. Ukraine is not collapsing, it's fighting harder than ever. Zelensky is not fleeing. He's leading from the front and defining the response to Russian threats. And the West is not abandoning Ukraine. They're standing alongside Zelensky in rejecting Putin's demands. This is not the war Putin planned. This is not the quick victory he promised. This is not the submission he expected. And this is not a trajectory that ultimatums can reverse. What makes this moment so significant and so dangerous is that Putin's ultimatum happened at a time when the Russian president is under extraordinary domestic and international pressure. Russian military commanders are demanding more resources after catastrophic losses. Russian nationalist commentators are demanding faster progress and more aggressive action. Russian oligarchs are demanding relief from sanctions that have frozen their assets. Russian mothers are demanding answers about sons who have disappeared into the war. Russian security services are demanding results that justify their enormous influence. Putin is trying to balance these contradictory demands while simultaneously managing a military conflict that has consumed an estimated 400,000 Russian casualties. And when leaders in that position issue dramatic public ultimatums, they're not doing it from confidence. They're doing it from pressure. They're doing it from desperation. They're doing it because they need something, anything, to change the momentum of a conflict that is slowly grinding down Russian military and economic capacity. That's what makes Zelensky's response so significant. Putin was looking for signs of weakness. He was probing for cracks in Western resolve. He was hoping that threats would produce hesitation. Instead, he got defiance. Immediate, public, unmistakable defiance. And that defiance was backed by military action that demonstrated Ukraine's continued capability. The White House statement, now distributed to all American diplomatic missions worldwide, was designed to signal that the United States stands firmly behind Ukraine's response. Administration officials said plainly that Putin's ultimatum was inconsistent with every principle of international law and represents an attempt to coerce through threats what Russia cannot achieve on the battlefield. That is diplomatic language for, your demands are rejected, and we will continue supporting Ukraine's defense. You don't usually hear that kind of directness from American officials unless something fundamental is at stake. Meanwhile, Downing Street issued a parallel statement that was equally pointed. The United Kingdom rejects in the strongest terms any attempt to dictate the security policies of sovereign nations through ultimatums or threats. Our support for Ukraine is unwavering, and no Russian demand will alter that commitment. The French Foreign Ministry added its voice, describing Putin's ultimatum as an affront to the international order that democratic nations are committed to defending. The German government, often more measured in its public statements, called the ultimatum unacceptable and counterproductive to any genuine peace effort. The message from Western capitals was unanimous. Putin's demands were rejected. Zelensky's defiance was supported. And the alliance remains united. But it was Zelensky's speech that captured the moment most powerfully. Standing in the heart of Kyiv, not hiding, not retreating, not seeking shelter from Russian missiles, he addressed the world in a forceful, emotional speech tonight. He said, "Vladimir Putin demands that our friends abandon us. He demands that the nations who believe in freedom surrender to his threats. He demands that Ukraine accept defeat. We have one answer, no." He said, "Every day Russian missiles kill our people. Every day Russian soldiers occupy our land. Every day Russian propaganda lies about our nation. And now Vladimir Putin demands that the world accept this as normal. We will never accept it." And he said, "To those who wonder whether Ukraine will continue to fight, I say this, look at our soldiers. Look at our cities that rebuild after every strike. Look at our people who refuse to submit. That is your answer. Ukraine does not surrender. Ukraine does not submit. And Ukraine will never bow to ultimatums." These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are the words of a wartime leader who understands that his response will echo through history. Zelensky knows that how Ukraine responds to this ultimatum will define not just this conflict, but the principles that the international community is willing to defend. And his answer was unmistakable. Here's what makes the current situation even more volatile. Putin's ultimatum wasn't issued in isolation. Along with the public demands to Washington and London, Russian strategic bombers conducted unusual patrol patterns near NATO airspace, forcing multiple allied nations to scramble interceptor aircraft. Russian naval forces in the Baltic Sea moved into positions that defense analysts described as demonstratively aggressive. Russian cyber units launched probing attacks against critical infrastructure in several European nations. Russian state media launched a coordinated campaign designed to amplify fear about nuclear escalation. Russian diplomatic missions delivered what were described as verbal warnings to their host governments about the consequences of continued support for Ukraine. All of this happened within the same 72-hour window. When Putin moves on multiple fronts simultaneously, It means he's trying to create a sense of overwhelming pressure. But it also reveals something important: desperation. A leader who was genuinely confident in his position would not need to issue public ultimatums. A leader who was genuinely winning would not need to threaten every major Western capital simultaneously. Putin's multi-front pressure campaign is designed to mask the reality that his military operation has failed to achieve its objectives, and his strategic options are narrowing. Intelligence analysts are now considering several possibilities for what comes next. One is that Putin will attempt some form of escalation designed to demonstrate that his threats carry weight, perhaps intensified attacks on Ukrainian civilian infrastructure, perhaps provocative actions near NATO territory. Another is that Putin will quietly step back from his ultimatum, pretending that it was merely a statement of principles rather than a genuine demand requiring response. A third possibility, the one that has officials most concerned, is that Putin, feeling publicly humiliated by the unified Western rejection and Zelensky's dramatic defiance, will order some action intended to reassert Russian credibility. But today, Zelensky took the initiative. He didn't wait to see how Putin would react to Western responses. He didn't hesitate out of fear of escalation. He didn't moderate his language to avoid provocation. He spoke with absolute clarity. And then he backed those words with military action. In doing so, Zelensky demonstrated that Ukraine will not allow Russia to control the narrative or the tempo of this conflict. What we're watching now is a test of credibility. Putin wants to see if ultimatums and threats can still produce Western hesitation. Zelensky wants to demonstrate that Ukraine will not be intimidated regardless of what Russia threatens. The United States wants to prove that it will not abandon allies under pressure. The United Kingdom wants to show that its commitment to European security transcends political transitions. And Europe wants to demonstrate that the lessons of history have been learned, that appeasing aggressors only invites more aggression. All of these tests are playing out simultaneously. And the results will shape not just this conflict, but the future of international relations for generations. Because if Putin's ultimatum fails, and it is failing, it establishes a precedent. It proves that nuclear threats cannot coerce democratic alliances. It proves that defiance, backed by capability, can overcome intimidation. It proves that the international order, however imperfect, can still resist those who would overturn it through force. Tonight, we've heard from defense officials who are now monitoring Russian military activity with heightened vigilance. They say Russian strategic forces have not changed their posture in response to Zelensky's defiance, a significant indicator that Putin's nuclear rhetoric remains largely theatrical. They say Russian conventional forces in Ukraine are scrambling to reinforce positions after Ukraine's precision strikes degraded key logistics nodes. And they say Putin's decision to issue such a dramatic public ultimatum, only to have it immediately and comprehensively rejected, likely reflects internal Kremlin dynamics that are driving decisions rather than careful strategic calculation. But Ukraine is not pausing to assess. In fact, Ukraine is maintaining operational tempo. Zelensky's defiance today, bold, public, and backed by action, sent a message to Putin that threats will be answered with resolve. And it sent a message to the West that Ukraine knows exactly what it's fighting for. This is a partner that will not waver. This is a leader who will not flinch. This is a nation that understands the stakes and is willing to bear them. As the coming days unfold, we expect more details to emerge about the full impact of Ukraine's military response and how the Kremlin will react to the comprehensive rejection of its demands. But what we do know is that Zelensky's response was exactly what the moment required. It demonstrated that ultimatums will not be rewarded with submission. It showed that the alliance between Ukraine and its Western partners remains solid. Message clipped, view entire message.